Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and good evening to all. Welcome to our webinar session, X3 Talks, Palestine 101, What We Need to Know. This is the third episode of the X3 Talk series. My name is Farhan bin Abdurrahman and I'll be your moderator for tonight. Thank you for tuning in. This webinar is brought to you by MCKK alumni from class of 2013, especially in conjunction with the Eid al-Adha celebration on Monday. Special shout out to Malay College, Billy Foundation and Epica Production for organizing the webinar. Tonight we will be discussing key topics surrounding the Palestinian struggle for freedom. And for this, I am joined by our esteemed speakers. Allow me to introduce our speakers for tonight. So our first speaker is Issa Amro. He is a human rights defender and activist based in Hebron, the West Bank. He is a co-founder and former coordinator of the grassroots group Youth Against Settlements. He advocates the use of nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience to fight the Israeli occupation. Our second speaker, a very dear friend of mine, is Mahamood Mubarak. Mahamood is currently a public policy student specializing in refugee issues. Previously, back in the UK, he was part of the Youth and Student Committee of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, which is an organization based in the UK. In 2018, he conducted a capstone project at Imperial College London on the feasibility of Israel-Palestine conflict resolution, which led to his 3-week visit and volunteering in the West Bank. And our third speaker, Muslim Imran, who will join us a bit later. He is a Palestinian academician and activist based in Kuala Lumpur. He is the chairman of the Palestinian Cultural Organization Malaysia and currently pursuing his PhD in International Relations in University Malaya. In 2015, he published a book entitled Egypt, Syria, and the War on Gaza. So thank you again for tuning in. Some housekeeping. If you have questions, feel free to type in your question in the comment section. We will have Q&A session at the end of our forum tonight. So without further ado, I guess you're all excited to hear from our speakers. Let's welcome our first speaker, Issa, who will be describing the situation across Palestine and what gives rise to the status quo. He will also speak about the resistance movement in Palestine. Issa, over to you. I think you're muted, Issa.
Thank you very much, Farhan, for organizing this event. I want to thank our brothers and sisters in Malaysia for continuous support for the Palestinian cause against the Israeli occupation. I want to give a historical background of what was happening in Palestine in the last 100 years. 1917, Balfour gave the promise of creating a home for the Jews in Palestine on the expense of the Palestinian people. Balfour was, gave this promise after the end of the First World War, and they wanted to create a home for the Jews in Palestine on the expense of the Palestinian people. Then the British mandate governed Palestine until 1948. Palestinians, they tried to resist the British mandate. They were very poor. They were not, rich. In one hand, the Europeans and other countries and other, they didn't support the Palestinians. They supported the British mandate, and the Jews were coming from all over to Palestine to immigrate to Palestine. It was Palestine until 1948 when Israel was established and announced, and the first two countries who recognized Israel as a state was Russia, then the United States. Then Palestinians continued the resistance, and in 48, around 300 Palestinian villages were destroyed and damaged during the 1948 war, and 800 Palestinians were evicted from their land, and we call it the catastrophe, the Palestinian Nakba. Then 1967, Israel occupied the rest of Palestine and Golan Heights and Sinai. In the 1967 war, they occupied East Jerusalem, Hebron, and the rest of West Bank, and other refugees, Palestinian refugees, were were evicted, or they escaped to Jordan, to Egypt, or to Syria, or to Lebanon. So the Palestinian refugees problem started 48 and continued 1967. Palestinians didn't stay silent about the Israeli occupation of 1948 and 1967. They organized themselves in military resistance, and then 1987 they organized the first intifada, and the first intifada was popular resistance against the Israeli occupation, and Palestinians used a lot of community resistance, strikes, peaceful protests, sit-ins, and other resistance methodologies in Palestine. Then 1993, the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, signed the peace process with Israel. They called it Oslo Accord, accepting the two-state solution. Unfortunately, 1994, in February, Baruch Goldstein went into the Brahimi Mosque in Hebron, killed 29 Palestinians, 100 were injured. Palestinians were very angry, and they felt that Israel doesn't want peace, because the result of that massacre was to punish the Palestinians in Hebron. And then the Israeli right wing killed Rabin, 1995. Then, the right wing took power in Israel, especially Netanyahu took power, and they were very open in announcing that they don't want a two-state solution. They think Israel is from the river to the sea, and there is no Palestine. So the peace process was killed two times. One when after the Brahimi Mosque massacre, then after Rabin was killed and Netanyahu took power. But the international community put pressure on Israel to sign Hebron Protocol. So Netanyahu in 1997 signed the Hebron Protocol, Hebron Redeployment Agreement, where Hebron was divided for two parts, H1, H2, and Palestinians were they were hoping to have their states on 1999, but Israel didn't give them the state. They refused to give up Jerusalem. They refused to accept that the Palestinian refugees come back from abroad, and they refused to give up the control of Area C, because in Oslo Accord, they divided the land to A, B, C. A under the Palestinian security and civilian control, which is 16% of West Bank and Gaza. And then Area B, which is under the Palestinian civilian control, and it's around 20% of the land and under the Israeli security control. And Area C, which is around 62% of the land in West Bank, it's Area C, which means that it's under the Israeli military and civilian control. So Palestinians are, don't have any authority in this land, civilians or security. But Israel didn't want peace. They continued building the settlements. They refused to give up the land. So Palestinians and Sharon invaded Al-Aqsa. So Palestinians started the Second Intifada. Second Intifada started 2000, and Palestinians paid very high price of resisting the occupation. Unfortunately, our resistance was described as terror by many international community and the countries, and we Palestinians suffered a lot. The Israeli occupation arrested, killed many Palestinian leaders, and then we had election in 2006, and Hamas won the election, and the international community and Israel didn't accept the results of the Palestinian transparent election, and we had division between Gaza and West Bank based on not respecting the election results. From that time, Palestinians, they suffer division between Gaza and West Bank, and we suffer from the brutality of the Israeli occupation and Israeli settlements. 2015, Palestinians started a kind of uprising, but they were oppressed and they were suppressed by the Israeli occupation, and they tried to force us to accept the Trump the peace deal, which was not a deal. It was about to give up Jerusalem and give up the refugees' rights and to even give up Area C. And Israel has started something called annexation of West Bank. And the previous American administration put high pressure on the Palestinians. They cut the aid. They cut the aid to UNRWA. They forced other countries to stop donating to the UNRWA. UNRWA is responsible. Then we as Palestinians continued resisting the Israeli occupation peacefully with popular resistance in the right to return marches in Gaza, because Gaza is sieged since almost 15 years. So the people in Gaza are suffering more than the people in West Bank. But Israel created different realities. So the Palestinians are sorted by different types. We are 5 different types. So we have Palestinians, they live in 48. They have the Israeli citizenship, but they don't have equality with other Jews because of the nation state law, which doesn't, and many other laws inside Israel. And then we have Palestinians, they live in Jerusalem and they have a blue IDs, and they have, they are allowed to enter Jerusalem and they have certain rights inside Jerusalem and West Bank. And we have Palestinians with green IDs. They live in West Bank, and they have less rights than the Palestinians in East Jerusalem. And we have Palestinians. They live in Gaza, and they are sieged. They have green IDs. And we have the Palestinians who live in refugees in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria, in Egypt, and they suffer the most, especially the refugees in Syria and in Lebanon. Nowadays, the Israeli occupation is trying to annex Area C, which is 62% of West Bank, to Israel without the Palestinians. So you see a lot of settlements, and the settlements were 4 or 5 times doubled from 1993. So we have around 600,000-700,000 settlers living in West Bank and in Jerusalem illegally, because all the settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories are illegal according to Geneva Convention Article 49, and it's a war crime. And Palestinians, they really try to use nonviolent resistance, as what happened in Jerusalem during the anti-metal detectors, because Israel tried to use metal detectors, as they do in the Ibrahim Mosque in Hebron. They try to use the metal detectors to restrict the number of Palestinians who are going into Al-Aqsa Mosque. And really, Palestinians won by praying outside, protesting outside, sitting in outside the mosque and in the Jerusalem. I mean, sitting in with hundreds and thousands of people. And the right of return marches in Gaza gave everybody in the world that Palestinians use popular resistance successfully. Lately, Israel is trying to evict many Palestinian communities in Jerusalem. For example, Sheikh Jarrah families are suffering and facing eviction. Batn al-Hawa in Silwan too, they are facing eviction too. In Beit Hanina, many families in Jerusalem are facing eviction, to be evacuated from their homes. Many families in Jordan Valley near the Dead Sea are facing eviction, because many Bedouins in South Mount Hebron, they are facing eviction. We are talking about thousands of families are facing eviction these days, and Israel is trying to do something called de facto annexation by creating roads, bridges, and infrastructure for the Israeli settlements in one hand. In the other hand, house demolition Palestinian house demolition in Area C is happening almost every day, and more restrictions in Area C for the Palestinians. For example, Hebron city, where I live, we have 22 checkpoints in 1 kilometer square. Checkpoint means an Israeli soldier with high-tech metal detectors and cameras. They really restrict our freedom of movement. And we have around 100 movement barriers and restricting our movement to 1,800 shops, which is 77% of the shopping area in H2 closed by the Israeli military. Hebron 2, it means the area under the Israeli military control. We have 1,000 apartments became empty. It means that 1,000 Palestinian apartments became empty because of the continuous harassments and the closure policy of the Israeli occupation. They changed the names of the streets and the neighborhoods from Palestinian Arabic names to an Israeli Hebrew names, and even the redeployment agreement, which was signed 1997, the Israeli government doesn't respect it, and they have military bases inside H2, the area under the Palestinian control theoretically, because the Israeli military, they invade all over West Bank area A, B, or C, or H1 or H2. We, the Palestinians, are trying to reach the international community to make the occupation costly. So we worked a lot with Human Rights Watch, who described Israel in their recent report as an apartheid state from the river to the sea. Even B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights organization, described Israel as an apartheid state from the river to the sea. The UN Human Rights Council published the names of 112 companies who are investing in the Israeli settlements, and they call them the companies blacklist. We, the Palestinians, we try to remain steadfast and protect our Palestinian identity. We try to speak in the social media to our brothers and sisters all over the world to organize them and mobilize them against the Israeli occupation, Israeli settlement, and Israeli apartheid.
Okay, thank you, Issa. That's a very comprehensive background of the situation in Palestine. And I think hearing your detailed description of what's happening throughout Palestine is devastating. And I'm sure the audience shares the same frustration. Thanks again, Issa. Okay, now let's move on to our next speaker, a fellow Malaysian, Mahamood Mubarak. He will be speaking on the topic of anti-Semitism, and he will also touch on the principles of showing solidarity with Palestinians. Let's welcome Mahmoud. Mahmoud, floor is yours.
Thank you, Farhan. Thank you for having me. So yes, when we talk about Israel-Palestine issue, we need to understand that Israel is not the first settler colonialism project. America, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, actually all of these are a result of a settler colonialism project. And we know how colonialism ended. And Israel is just another colonialism project. And the state has been facing criticism for decades now. And like what Issa Amro mentioned just now, the conflict has been initiated since Balfour Declaration in 1917. And the fight against Israeli occupation have been ongoing until now. So I think it is important to understand how the settler colonialism state and this apartheid state can still go on, and how the conflict is prolonged. And for that purpose, I want to touch on anti-Semitism and how it has been used to lower the impact or even cancel the Palestine Solidarity movement across the world. So for those who are new to the term, there are many definitions of anti-Semitism, but I think it's fair to say anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. For example, this can be promoting the harming of Jews in the name of ideology or religion, promoting negative stereotypes of Jews, holding Jews collectively responsible for the actions of an individual Jewish person or group, denying the Holocaust or accusing Jews of exaggerating the Holocaust, and etc. I think many of us can agree that it is common to have someone in Malaysia to come up to us with anti-Semitic remarks and make claims such as Jews rule the world and how they are being the core of certain problems or agenda. And actually I just figured out Malaysia is labeled as one of the most anti-Semitic nations in the world, and apparently the most anti-Semitic nation in East and Southeast Asia. And I personally believe that this is quite an exaggeration, as Malaysians may not have ill intentions towards the Jews, but the elements of anti-Semitism are there in our community. And we need to be aware of the sensitivity of this issue, and not to make any remark or condone any action that can cause any association with anti-Semitism. So why, when we talk about anti-Semitism, why it is an issue? So we need to understand, when it comes to supporting Palestinians, it should be about them and not us. So every statement, every action, and every move that we decide to act for Palestine, it needs to consider the impact to the Palestinians and to Palestine Solidarity movement. So because anti-Semitism, this is important because anti-Semitism has been weaponized by Israel and pro-Israel actors, and it reduces the impact of the Palestinian Solidarity movement around the world. And we can see today how criticisms to Israel and its brutal occupation do slip away as Israel would frame and link the criticisms to anti-Semitism. And when this happens, it creates a distraction from the real issue. And sometimes we just randomly attack the action of Israel with anti-Semitic remarks when it should be about how and why Israel is wrong and what should be done. So we have to understand that when we criticize Israel, even when the criticism is triggered by what's happening to the Palestinians, giving out anti-Semitic remarks can be counterproductive, and it won't translate into good impacts to the Palestine solidarity movement and activism. So because this is actually because when people perceive our response as anti-Semitic, rather than giving attention to the Palestinians and the conflict, the attention would be on anti-Semitism. And this is a shame, actually, because every time Palestine Israel is on the news, or when the topic is trending, it is an opportunity to raise awareness on the issue and to bring more people to the movement. And now that I mentioned about anti-Semitism, I think it's quite important to explain how the Jews and non-Muslims involvement when it comes to supporting for Palestine. So this is not new to Palestinians or activists out there, but I think it's important to highlight that the Jewish people has been a part of support system to the Palestinians in the fight against Israel occupation. So when I was with Palestine Solidarity Campaign (PSC) a couple of years ago, many of our members were Jewish, and they dedicated their time and money on Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And there are many other groups across the world, such as If Not Now, which is founded by Jewish people who fights against Israeli occupation. And in the UK, Jews for Justice for Palestinians were founded by Jewish people, and they oppose Israeli's policy that could be threatening Palestinian rights. And within Israel itself, Issa, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are many organizations and groups such as Big Salem, Breaking the Silence, Boycott from Within, Gisha, and many other groups. We actually supported by Israelis and Jews, and these organizations, they are actually fighting for peace, protections of Palestinians' human rights, and they are against Israel current violations of human rights as well. So when and I think when I was in Khan al-Ahmar in 2018, by the way, Khan al-Ahmar is a Bedouin village near Jerusalem, which is at risk of demolition by Israel. So in 2018, when it was made clear that the Bedouin village was going to be demolished, activists either from Palestine or all over the world, we came together and we stayed there to show support and to protest the demolition. And Jewish people and Jewish organizations were part of the protest and the support. So they were there to support and basically a part of the movement. And just to relate back to anti-Semitism, it is unfair for people showing support to the Palestinians, and a part of the it is unfair for people showing support to Palestinians and a part of the solidarity movement to say anything anti-Semitic, because it is just counterproductive, and it also denies the current work and contribution of Jewish community, a contribution of them to end the Palestine-Israel conflict. And this should make it clear that anti-Semitism has no place in the fight against Israel. And the message that we should adopt here is that we have to be against anti-Semitism as much as we are against Israeli occupation. And now that I've mentioned how the Jews and many people, regardless of their background, are showing solidarity with Palestinians, I think it's important that we realize and acknowledge that free Palestine or the liberation of Palestinian people is not a religion issue. In fact, it has never been a religious issue. So for many people, particularly in Malaysia, still associate the current situation in Palestine with religions, especially Islam and Judaism. So of course, no one can deny the importance of Palestine to Muslims. But when it concerns Palestinian people, I think there should be a clear line between our religion connection to the land and the Palestinian people. So we're not supporting Palestinians because of certain buildings or mosques located in that country. We are demanding an end to Israel-Palestine conflict because we are not demanding an end to Israel-Palestine conflict because just because Palestine is home to sacred places according to Islam and other religion. I think we should really ask ourselves if let's say if there's no Al-Aqsa Mosque, if there's no Ibrahimi Mosque, if there's no Prophet's tomb in Palestine, if Jesus was not born or crucified there, or the land has no connection to our religion, will we still be a part of Palestinian Solidarity movement? And will we support Palestinian fight against Israeli oppression and apartheid state? I think that's very important for us to reflect and ask ourselves. But don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we should not have connection to the land. I've been there, and even until now, I go to sleep thinking about Al-Aqsa, Ibrahimi Mosque, and all the people that I met during my stay there. But the life of Palestinians should not be valuable to us just because they happen to be in a land that has historical importance to us. And when it comes to expressing our support and getting other people to join the solidarity movement, and our motive or our reason should be a right one, which for me I always see as a human right issue, and the end of the conflict is actually a progress for humanity. And the good thing is that people, especially our generation, are becoming more aware of this, and they engage with the solidarity movement for the right reasons, either from the perspective of human rights or international relations. But many people are still stuck to the religious and anti-Semitic narrative, which I think we have the responsibility to enlighten these people and to correct them, because in the context of Malaysia, people just don't know, and it is the result of our upbringing or misconception that we have on the topic. And just to conclude my point, it is important for us to frame the fight against Israel correctly, and our support to Palestine must be based on the right reason. And our solidarity with Palestinians should not be anchored to a certain belief, political ideology, religious narrative, race, or national, because that's the very tool that the Zionists and the pro-Israelis are using to justify the settler colonialism in Palestine. And we have to subscribe to the right narrative, which I suppose, I believe it should be on human rights, the rights of Palestinians, the history of Palestine, international law, whatever that can help the cause of Palestine. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that our criticism to Israel can be based on anything, but not prejudice, discrimination, or racism such as anti-Semitism. And everything that we say or we write when expressing support to Palestinians should be about Palestinians and the oppression they are facing from Israel's apartheid state or the settler colonialism. And nowadays, as everyone has a voice and platform to express their opinion freely, I think we have to take the responsibility to educate others, especially when we see them giving anti-Semitic remarks or not subscribing to the right narrative when it comes to Palestine-Israel conflict. That will be all from me. Farhan, back to you.
Thank you, Mahmood. I think that is very brilliantly put. Thank you for highlighting the importance of showing solidarity with Palestinians and highlighting the importance of not falling into the trap of anti-Semitism. Thank you again, Mahmood. Let's now welcome our final speaker, Muslim Imran. Muslim will be focusing on why we need to care about the Palestinian struggle and what is required to be done by Palestinians and the rest of the international community to help put an end to the ongoing sufferings. Let's welcome Mr. Imran. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the invitation, and I wish everyone a good evening. The discussion is an important one because the Palestinian struggle has come to a stage where we are waiting for the historical moment where we get our freedom. I don't believe that the Palestinian issue is in its most difficult times. We have redefining our struggle, where we are bringing our voices to the world. So it is important to highlight first the historical background and to look into the current situation, and then discuss what should be done, what the Palestinians have to do, and what the international community, the international solidarity movement should do. Starting with the historical background, and I'll be very brief. I do believe that the Palestinian issue, the Palestinian problem, the Palestinian struggle did not start in Palestine. The problem of Zionist occupation of Palestine started in Europe. It was a European problem. The European societies in the late 18th century, late 19th century, were not okay with their Jewish communities. An injustice on the Jewish communities in Europe was done by the ultranationalist European movements and European powers, and incidents like the Russian pogroms took place. Anti-Semitism, which my colleague, my fellow panelist, was discussing, took place, and the Jewish people in Europe tried to escape that Jewish problem, what used to be framed as a Jewish problem, through their own ultranationalist movement. Unfortunately for the Palestinians, the Zionist movement, which started in late 19th century, managed to persuade some Western colonial powers of its plans and agenda, and their interests overlapped. By the turn of the century, in the early days of the 20th century, the Zionist movement, which has already organized itself politically through the World Zionist Organization, had agreements and deals with the Western superpowers, most particularly the British superpower, and during the First World War, they were granted access to Palestine and the Balfour Declaration. Now, before the Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917, the British and the Zionist movement have had an agreement on the future of Palestine, a homeland for the Jewish people. This is not the mistake of the Palestinian people. We have not created the Jewish problem. It was created in Europe. It was European societies that committed racism and discrimination and anti-Semitism, what have to come to be called anti-Semitism against the Jewish communities. Not the Palestinians, not the Arabs, not the Muslims. But eventually, international development led to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the establishment of a colonial rule in Palestine in the year 1917, which helped the Zionist movement migrate to Palestine. And for 30 years, the Jewish communities in Europe and elsewhere started to migrate to Palestine. By the year 1947, the Zionist movement had successfully brought over hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants to Palestine. They helped them financially, politically, organizationally. They set up their own institutions. They trained their own militias. And by 1947, when the international community intervened and decided to partition Palestine through the United Nations partition resolution, the Zionist movement, which had more than 100,000 militiamen, started its plan to take over Palestine. This is now well documented by Israeli historians themselves, who studied the documents, the declassified documents of the Zionist army, especially in the 1990s, and they concluded that the Haganah and other Zionist militias, which founded the State of Israel, which became later called the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, they had a plan to conduct ethnic cleansing in Palestine. And for 6 months, from 1947 to 1948, Israeli militias killed thousands of Palestinians, stole and robbed Palestinian properties, destroyed 500 Palestinian towns and cities, and created the state of Israel. This new establishment resulted in the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. This is actually the root cause of the problem. So today, when we're discussing the Palestinian problem, it has been shaped by the Nakba, by the ethnic cleansing that took place 72 years ago in Palestine. Now, the Israeli state, the new Israeli state, had the choice or the option of becoming a normal part of the region. They could have extended their hands, to their neighbors. They could have tried to work out a solution with the Palestinian population, but they chose not to. And the very nature of the Zionist movement is a settler colonial ideology. The very nature of the state of Israel is expansionism, is creation of new settlements. And this explains why they continue to build settlements in the supposedly future Palestinian state in the West Bank. They continue until today to expand their settlements. They built settlements in the Golan Heights in Syria. They built settlements earlier in Lebanon, but they had to leave it. The Zionist state is an expansionist state by nature. The Zionist ideology is a right-wing, extremist, expansionist ideology. They continued from 1948 until today, 2021, to build more settlements, to expand their influence and their domain of rule. And eventually they failed in many places. They failed in the Sinai, they had to leave. They failed in Lebanon, they had to move out in 2000. They failed in Gaza, they had to leave in 2005. But that's the nature of the Israeli state. And that's why international law doesn't matter to them. The international conventions don't really matter to them. International resolutions don't matter to them. The Palestinians can talk about peace until the end of life. And Israeli settlers will continue to expand their settlements in the West Bank and will continue to build some new settlements in the Golan Heights. So through 70 or 73 years of Israeli occupation, Israel has continued to be an expansionist colonial entity, but it has transformed itself into an apartheid regime. And these are two different terms or labels, but in the case of Israel, they happen to go side by side. Israel was founded by the secular leftist Zionist movement, but in the 70s, it started to shift to the right. By the 1990s, the Israeli right-wing groups dominated the discourse in Israel. And since the year 2000 until today, the Israeli right-wing groups dominate the political scenario and landscape in Israel. We have had Zionist, ultra-nationalist or Zionist religious groups ruling Israel since the year 2000. Sharon, Olmert, Netanyahu, and now Bennett. Every few years, the Israeli discourse, political discourse, shifts to the right. So terms like expulsion of Palestinians, terms like transfer, are not alien to the Israeli political discourse. It's actually interesting, yet disgusting, to see that one of the most commonly spoken about political terms in the Israeli media is transfer. They discuss transferring millions of Palestinians outside the West Bank to Jordan and elsewhere, or even in Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel. They discuss transferring them publicly, and they think it's very okay to do so. So Israel has transformed into an apartheid. One of the most recent developments in Israel was the vote in the Knesset on the Citizenship Act. The Israeli parliament has been deliberating and discussing forming a new law, a new act, which will ban Palestinian citizens of Israel from getting married to other Palestinians. Because eventually, if they get married, they will not be able to bring their spouses to Israel, while Jewish people from anywhere can just come to Israel and become citizens overnight. The Palestinians have no right of return. So this is just an example of the kind of system that exists now in Israel. To conclude this part, Israel has transformed from a settler colonial occupation into a settler colonial occupation practicing apartheid in the light of day. And international commissions and committees and Israeli NGOs themselves started to expose this and document it. One of the panelists has just spoken about the report of the Human Rights Watch, a very recent report which documents Israel as an apartheid. And Human Rights Watch is a respected international human rights group. Israel's leading human rights group, B'Tselem, has also issued a report a few months earlier documenting that Israel has become an apartheid. 4 years ago, a United Nations Commission for West Asia has also published a similar report. It's not a secret anymore. Israel is a full-fledged apartheid. Sorry, technical problem. So Israel, this apartheid regime, is facing serious problems also. I mean, since we have highlighted that Israel evolved from a Zionist occupation to an expansionist regime to an apartheid regime, let's agree that it is facing serious problems now. Internal political turmoil, which does not have any end in sight. Serious Palestinian resistance in the form of armed resistance from Gaza, popular resistance in the West Bank, rights movement inside Israel amongst the Palestinians in Israel, Palestinian refugees demanding right of return, international solidarity with the Palestinian movement growing every day, including in Israel's strongholds, the US and Europe. So we're talking about serious challenges that the Zionist regime is facing now. It is necessary for the international solidarity movement to discuss this and to articulate strategies to speed up the end of Israeli apartheid and Israeli occupation. The Palestinians have not stopped working hard on this. The Palestinians in Gaza started by throwing stones and ended up creating their own defensive arsenal, weapons of defense. The Palestinians in the West Bank continue until today to protest and demonstrate every day to demand an end of Israeli settler occupation and an end of Israeli apartheid. Every few days there are new martyrs in Palestinian cities and towns, and one of the most successful examples of how Palestinian popular resistance forced Israelis to change their policies was the recent development in Beta near Nablus, where Palestinian protesters forced the Israeli government to end one of its expansionist projects in the town. The Palestinians elsewhere continue to join this march for freedom, but this requires a well-defined, comprehensive strategy on the part of the international solidarity movement. You know, the Palestinians in Palestine will go and protest, demonstrate, throw a stone, or do whatever they can. The Palestinians, get detained by Israel, get shot by Israel, but they continue to do this. We outside Palestine, whether Palestinians in the diaspora or the international solidarity movement, have to come up with our own strategies to support this resistance. One of the important points on our agenda should be how to delegitimize the Zionist regime. It is very necessary to work in the legal sphere and in the IR, international relations spheres, to isolate Israel internationally. Israel has evolved into an apartheid. I don't think anyone, any sane person or institution that respects itself would accept to associate with Israel. But there are some institutions and individuals who continue to do so. We have to work hard on persuading them, on delegitimizing Israel, on bringing its leaders to justice through International Court of Justice and International Criminal Court. We have to learn from the experience of the Black movement in South Africa to bring down the Zionist apartheid, just like the African apartheid, the white rule in South Africa succeeded in bringing down apartheid. We have to learn from that experience and start to delegitimize the Zionist occupation. We have to make sure that we provide the Palestinian movement, the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, the Palestinian resistance with means of survival. It's important to see that in today's world, there are calls in many occasions to support indigenous movements against their own governments. So you see the Western community working day and night to help the Syrian opposition to bring down the regime in Damascus. You see them now condemning China for its treatment of some of its citizens. You see them, running to help the movement against government in Hong Kong. But you don't see the international community doing anything about the Palestinians who are being massacred in front of cameras. The latest development in Palestine did not start with the Palestinians this time around. Just again, Israel started massacring Palestinians inside Al-Aqsa Mosque. They cracked down on congregation in a holy place without any respect for the sanctity of the place or the sanctity of the time, and they expected the Palestinians to be helpless and just accept what happened. But that's not what the Palestinians did this time around. When Israel cracked down on the congregation inside Al-Aqsa, Palestinians protested all over Jerusalem, all over the West Bank, all over Israel, and in the Gaza Strip, and they mounted more pressure through armed resistance on Israel to end its aggression on Al-Aqsa and to pressure it to stop its Judaization policy of the city of Jerusalem. So there is a positive development. The Palestinians are working hard, but where is the international solidarity movement from this? There are positive developments. The BDS movement is gaining ground. It's very active now in Europe, very active in the US, it's very active here in Malaysia, but we want it to be active everywhere else. And we want to see the international community empowering the Palestinian resistance. Israel receives $3.8 billion of military aid a year from the United States, let alone the other forms of assistance, economic assistance, preferential treatments, European assistance, compensation money they get from Germany, etc. And of course, donations from Jewish philanthropies worldwide. What do the Palestinians get? Let's ask ourselves here in Malaysia and in around the world. What do the Palestinian resistance get? Unfortunately, there is some contribution, and we all appreciate it, especially individual contributions. But unfortunately, the major chunk of international contribution to the Palestinians goes to the corrupt institutions of the Palestinian Authority, to the Palestinian security forces, which equally represses the Palestinians in the West Bank. We don't see that money going to help Palestinian NGOs and charities inside the West Bank and Gaza. We don't see this international contributions going to help the Palestinians inside Israel. But we see millions of dollars, even from the US itself, going to help the Palestinian Authority security forces, which are doing the dirty job of Israeli colonialism. So back to our main focus, and to conclude, I do believe that the Palestinians are working hard. We did not start this mess. We did not start this problem. We did not bring Israel into our own land. We did not deserve what happened, and we continue to fight back and work hard to liberate our own homeland. But the international community has to cope with these Palestinian sacrifices. I know the international solidarity movement is working very hard. People like you, my fellow brothers and sisters watching this discussion, NGOs here in Malaysia and across the world are working really hard. Some raising funds, some exposing Israel's lies, some voicing out the Palestinian narrative, but that's not the majority. There is no critical mass yet in terms of international solidarity. The momentum is growing, especially in the West, but we need to do more. We want each and every one of you, be it an individual, an institution, an NGO, a government agency, a company, we want you to get involved. The minimum you can do is passive resistance through BDS, through boycotting Israeli-linked companies, Israeli businesses, Israeli military institutions. And there is more that you can do, of course, by contributing positively to empowering the Palestinians, voicing out their concerns, and supporting their resistance in Palestine. I'm sorry if I took a long time, but I tried to highlight my perspective on this, and I'll also be happy to discuss the point of anti-Semitism through the discussion.
Thank you, Muslim. I think it was great that you highlighted the atrocities committed against Palestinians, and also you highlighted reports showing that Israel is indeed an apartheid state, just like South Africa was. Thanks again, Muslim. We now have questions from the audience. So the first question is, this is following the appointment of Naftali Bennett as the new Prime Minister of Israel. So the question is, do you think the appointment of Naftali Bennett as the new Prime Minister could help end the crisis? This question is open to any of the panelists.
Okay. You want me to answer?
Yeah, sure. Issa, go on.
Naftali Bennett history is really very violent. He many times in public said that he killed Palestinians and he's very proud of that and he's ready to kill more Palestinians. Not only that, he was the head of the settlement council in the bank. He is a settler himself and he's very, very right wing. And he is not that much different from Netanyahu. On the contrary, he's much, much more radical than Netanyahu, and he's now working to annex the Area C, to build more settlements, to even make many Israeli outposts, Israeli settlement outposts, which is illegal even according to the Israeli law, illegal, and give the settlers more opportunity and for sure evict more Palestinians from Area C. We, the Palestinians, see all the Israeli leaders are the same. They all support the occupation, support the settlements, and support apartheid. What we should talk about is how to make the occupation costly for those leaders.
Okay, thank you, Issa. Anyone else wants to? Probably Muslim.
Yeah, Bennett, as Issa has rightly mentioned, is an extremist. He is on the right of Netanyahu. Netanyahu in the early 1990s was considered a radical. Today, he is seen as in the center. Not because he changed his views. Netanyahu continues to be one of the most despicable Israeli leaders. He is an extremist. In one of his books, for instance, A Place Among Nations, if you read Netanyahu talking about the Palestinians and the Israelis, and you read Mein Kampf of Hitler, you don't see a difference. Trust me. The same ideology, the same celebration of power. He worships power, and he thinks because he's powerful, he has right to dominate the Palestinians. This extremist leader, Netanyahu, is now considered more moderate than Bennett. So Bennett is a radical. Bennett is an extremist who killed Palestinians and who's proud about it, and who would not hesitate to kill more Palestinians. I see the Israeli political establishment becoming more radical, becoming demagogues who will bring about a religious war in the region, something that none of us wants. We don't want a religious war in Palestine, a mayhem where Muslims kill Jews and Jews kill Muslims. But Israel's government wants that. They are working day and night on doing that. The march that took place in Jerusalem, the flags march, and the Israeli expulsion of Palestinians from the city of Jerusalem, from Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan. This is not done by the Israeli marginal Israeli groups. This is not done by the Israeli NGOs. This is done by the state of Israel. The organized ethnic cleansing that is taking place now in Jerusalem, the extremist policies and measures that are being taken against Gaza, these are official state policies. The policy of Judaizing Jerusalem is an official Israeli policy. So we are dealing with an extremist political establishment, which keeps on moving right. So I won't be surprised if one day Israel's extremist governments push the region to a major religious conflict. Not because Arabs want it, not because Palestinians want it, but because the Israeli government's policies are pushing forward towards such mayhem.
Thank you, Muslim. Perhaps some comments from Mahmoud on Naftali Bennett?
Yeah, I just want to add to what Issa and Muslim already said. When it comes to ending the conflict, I think we have to look back at previous settler colonialism project. Like I said, this is not the first project that we've had or we've seen in this world. And if we look at South Africa, the apartheid didn't end because the white people woke up one morning and realized that they did wrong and they wanted to do the right thing. It was because of internal resistance and international resistance. And this is something that we can hope for. And I believe it will be the same dynamic here as well. And hopefully when we have more credible governments, when the big powers are more credible and the politicians are on the right side of history, and we have more like a strong international resistance, hopefully there will be real progress in this conflict.
Thank you so much, Mahmood. Next question. I believe this question is directed to Issa Amro. You've engaged with Americans, progressive politicians, and in general, how do you see the conflict going to end? Are they still pushing for a two-state solution, or is there another alternative to this?
Yes, we the Palestinians suffered a lot from Trump administration, but we were lucky that many American politicians moved to the left, especially Bernie Sanders and many other Democrats in the party. There is a huge debate about the Palestinian rights. Israel in the past was a consensus between the Republicans and the Democrats, and all were supporting Israel blindly, and Israel was not untouchable. Nobody dared even to criticize Israel in the United States. In the last 4 or 5 years, we see more American politicians criticizing the occupation, and even they reached the point to ask for conditional aid to Israel. So many politicians are asking, even, and among them, the Senator Bernie Sanders, asking even to cut the $3.8 billion which is going to Israel and give it to Gaza, to the Palestinians. That is a huge, let me say, achievement for the Palestinian people and for the Palestinian American movement, because we have many American groups and Jewish groups in the United States that are doing an amazing work anti the occupation and anti the blind support of the United States. For sure, now the establishment and the new government Biden is talking about two-state solution, but it's not even pushing to make a change. We are not there yet to make the occupation costly. For me, two states, one state, Israel is not there to have solution. They don't want to make a solution. If we say one state or two states or 50 states, Israel is going on with its annexation plan, with building more and more settlements, and Israel to be from the river to the sea. This is the plan of the religious Zionist movement inside Israel, and Naftali Bennett is the leader of the religious Zionist movement, because even Zionism changed from secular to religious. So we have a huge opportunity in the United States now to bring more support to the Palestinian people, especially we see more progressive Americans. So we should invest more time, more money, and more effort in the United States and other countries where we can put high pressure on Israel to make the occupation costly. This is what Palestinians now are focusing, to make the occupation costly, to force Israel to stop its human rights violation, to stop its settlements, and to accept to give Palestinian equal rights.
Does any of the panelists want to add some comments to that? Yeah, Muslim, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. There is a shift in the American society in the discourse on Israel, which is a good development. Israel used to be a bipartisan issue within the U.S. Political community. It's no more. The progressives, the Squad, and many other congressmen and women are coming forward to criticize Israel's policy. And as Brother Amr has rightly mentioned, Bernie Sanders' policy on the Israeli occupation has actually opened eyes. I do not consider Bernie Sanders' views on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to be very progressive, but he questioned the policy of the American establishment, which used to be very bipartisan in Israel. It was Obama who granted Israel $3.8 billion a year of arms and military aid. It was not Trump. So the establishment in the US has favored Israel for so long, but this is changing, and this is the role of the international solidarity movement. This is, honestly speaking, this is not the job of the Palestinians in the West Bank or Gaza or the Palestinians in Israel to go and approach the United States progressive voices, NGOs and groups. This is our job. This is your job. This is the job of everyone who has access to the US society and to the European society. Not enough has been done. Many are still unaware. Social media has helped a lot in opening eyes, but many still don't know. And many in power, many people in power do not do much. I raised the question in a discussion I had a few hours ago with some other Malaysian friends about Palestine. When Israel started its aggression on Al-Aqsa Mosque in May, and they waged a full-scale war on Gaza, how many OIC member state presidents and prime ministers picked up their phones and called President Biden on the issue? I think a handful, probably less than 5, did so. That means our theoretically speaking, our supporters are not doing everything they can. In fact, some are, on the contrary to that, some are now facilitating Israel's occupation. In the case of UAE, for instance, normalizing with Israel, granting Israeli citizens UAE citizenship, etc., etc. So not enough has been done. A lot has to be done to influence the American society positively on the Palestinian issue. And it's a democratic society. It's not very democratic, but it is a democratic society. So our efforts matter. You do a very simple Google search: Hollywood movies about the Holocaust. You will find on Wikipedia a very, very long list of movies from everywhere. You do a similar search in Google on movies about Nakba. Of course, you will not find any, but you will find a few pages. Of course, Wikipedia has nothing on this. You will find a few pages which tell you movies or films and documentaries about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Maximum you get is 150 movies and films, usually amateur movies and films. Have we done enough? I don't think so. I think this is our role, to reach out to these societies and to try to impact a change. But as my fellow Malaysian friend in the discussion just now said, it's not the white Europeans and Americans who are going to end the atrocities in Palestine, just like they were not the heroes in the case of South Africa. It's the indigenous people and their true supporters.
Thank you, Muslim. I think it only speaks the importance of, I think, everyone else apart from Europeans and the US in helping, really speaking against Israeli occupation. Okay, thank you again, Muslim. Now we have question directed to Mahmood, but anyone else who wants to answer this question can also take this question later. So Mahmood, how would you draw a line between solidarity with Palestine and being anti-Semitic? Please, Mahmood.
Okay. Yeah, I think there is a clear line. We need to understand that Israel-Palestine conflict has nothing to do with religions, but religions have been exploited to justify and prolong the conflict, either Islam or Judaism. And I guess it is important to keep educating ourselves on the issue of Palestine-Israel conflict. And I think as we know more about the conflict, we will understand better what we need to do and what we can't do on our side. And personally, I think anti-Semitism will always be associated with our support to Palestine, especially when it's been established that, in Malaysia's context, when it's been established that we are an anti-Semitic country. But this only means that we need to do more to show what we are against, that we are against anti-Semitism. And we live in a community and we have many platforms to share our voice now. So when you see someone talk about Palestine, but at the same time making anti-Semitic remarks, approach them, educate them. And in Malaysia, sometimes Palestine is politicized, and when you often see public figures or the politicians associate Palestinian struggle with religion or anti-Semitism. So when this happens, call it out and show why it is wrong. And hopefully over time, we'll get more people to be aware of anti-Semitism, and we can draw a clear line when it comes to it.
Thank you, Mahmood. Any comments from our speaker? If not, I'll move on to our next question. Okay, Issa, go on, Issa.
If I may just, Issa, go ahead.
You know, this is the new tactic of the pro-Israeli groups is to describe any solidarity with the Palestinian as anti-Semitism. That should not be an obstacle for us. So we should continue really exposing the occupation, exposing the Israeli human rights violations. We don't have any problem with the Jews. We have a big problem with Zionist and with occupation and with apartheid and with settlement. So we should be very clear about that, and we should even cooperate with Jewish groups who are working against occupation and against apartheid in Palestine. That how you can go over the anti-Semitism laws and statements and even accusation. But we should be brave and ready to pay the price of our solidarity with the Palestinian people.
Yeah. If I may just touch on the point of anti-Semitism, I do believe that the anti-Semitism discourse has been framed by Israel and its allies. And we should be very alert. We should not fall for their linguistic traps. Palestinians are Semitic. Arabs are Semitic. We have Palestinian Jews. Palestinians are mainly Muslims and Christians, and they have lived for centuries with Palestinian Jewish people without any problems. We did not conduct the Holocaust. It was Europeans who did so, and we have been fighting Israel and Zionism, not the Jewish people. There are millions of Jewish people living in Europe, Arab countries, and the US. Palestinian national liberation movements have never touched them. So let's not fall for their traps. Anti-Semitism discourse is one way of undermining the international solidarity movement. So let them say whatever they want to say, and we have to really be steadfast in criticizing Israel. Eventually, their lies and propaganda will be exposed. You see, with the prevalence of social media, it is very difficult now for Israel to tell the same lies again and again.
Thank you, Muslim and Issa. The next question it's a bit long question. I believe Israel received funds to develop their tech, military, and education. But for Palestine, most of the donation goes to charity, i.e. food, clothes, etc. Shouldn't we focus more on donating funds to develop the education and tech within Palestine itself, so it will empower to progressive living standard?
Palestinians need more political support than money. Money is important, but we need political support, and we need real pressure on the occupation in the countries. I am a person who believes in development, and development means that we should focus on developing the Palestinian education, the Palestinian health system, the Palestinian technology, and the Palestinian industry. But that is not easy under the occupation. So we should be smart, creative, how to donate to the Palestinian cause, and what are the priorities. For me, the priority is to generate political support in your own country and put pressure on your governments, in your political leaders. Even in Malaysia, what our government is doing for Palestine, for example, what the parliament in Malaysia is doing for Palestine. For example, what one of the ideas that the Malaysian parliament can do is to sanction on the blacklist of the UN who are investing in the Israeli settlements. For example, any international company investing in the Israeli settlement should not work in Malaysia. Make a law of sanction on anyone, and it's illegal, and it's according to the international law, because the settlements are war crimes. I'm not talking about Israel even itself that should boycott officially Israel, but Malaysian, for example, parliament can officially boycott the Israeli settlement product, goods, and the companies do sanction the companies who invest in the Israeli settlement. This is one of the ideas that even we can ask our brothers and sisters in Malaysia, where we have 100% support as Palestinians, but we don't have real concrete ideas and laws to make the occupation costly. This is one of the ideas that we want our brothers and sisters in Malaysia and all over the world, especially in the countries where we have a governmental support to.
Thank you. Maybe Muslim.
Yeah. Maybe Brother Mubarak first.
I'm good. I think Issa really summarized what I thought about this question, and I have nothing to say for now.
Yeah, I also agree with Issa, but I wish to also bring attention to an important issue. The amount of aid and support that Israel gets is preposterous. If you sum up all the contributions, aid, donations of the OIC member states and international community to Palestine on one hand, and compare it with the international aid that Israel gets, there is no comparison. Israel receives $3.8 billion of military aid every year from the United States. That's not for the economy, that's not for education, that's not for research and development, that's to the Israeli military to kill us. They also receive a lot of funds for research and development in the military sector. The American administration conducts a lot of experiments and studies for the Israeli military. Add to that the huge contributions of the international Jewish diaspora to the Judaization projects in Jerusalem and in the rest of Palestine. We're talking about billions of dollars every year pouring into the Israeli budget to kill us, to Judaize Jerusalem, and to steal more of our land. People like Yaqub, that young Jewish settler in Jerusalem. If you saw the video of Muna al-Kurd asking him, "Why did you steal my house?" And he was telling her, "If I don't steal it, somebody else will steal it." This guy is being sponsored by the Zionist state and the Zionist NGOs to come to Palestine to steal our land. So don't think that the contributions of the international community to Palestine are enough. No, they're not enough. The Malaysian government, for instance, provides 4 million ringgits a year. That is about less than $1 million a year. Since the year 2010 until today, the official government grants to Palestine are less than $1 million a year. Compare that to the $3.8 billion that Israel gets from America for its military. And of course, the Malaysian contribution is highly appreciated, but it's in no way comparable to the ones that Israel receives from Europe and America. We have to really elevate the financial support to the Palestinian institutions, Palestinian charities, Palestinian NGOs, Palestinian people in general. But as Issa has just mentioned rightly, political support is of priority. If we don't end occupation, we will continue to have problems. We will not be able to invest, we will not be able to develop a decent life. So end occupation, and then we don't want any donations. We will in fact be able to develop a successful economy, a successful nation, which will invite people as tourists and investors. But currently we are under occupation. We can do nothing of that.
Thank you all for the response. This is probably the last question. So how do Palestinians in the West Bank, or for the matter of discussion, probably can extend to other parts of Palestine, deal with COVID-19? And does international aid help at this moment?
Okay. Israel has, restrictions on our importing and exporting, and they are the ones who decide what comes in and what comes out. So we were late with vaccination as Palestinians. Israel refused to vaccinate the Palestinians and give us vaccine against COVID-19. On the other hand, Israelis got vaccinated. Not only that, our health system is really weak, and we don't have enough financial resources to fight the pandemic. So Palestinians were paid very high price because of the pandemic, and Israel is really tried even to give us expired vaccine last month, and Palestinians were very angry about that, and their cooperation with corrupt leaders in the Palestinian Authority were really exposed in social media, and even an investigation committee investigated that, and they discovered a corruption of that deal. But Palestinians are very angry from Israel for not being able to be vaccinated. Only 20% of the Palestinians are vaccinated, and we are facing the fourth round of pandemic, and we are afraid that we will lose more lives. But our economy was affected severely, and we are really paying high price from the pandemic. Tourist economy completely closed and affected, and many other economies in Palestine. So Palestinians are really in a very bad economical and health situation these days, especially in Gaza. The Gazans are sieged, and they don't have enough resources to give even first aid medical support to their patient. How about the COVID-19? And really, the situation is not easy these days, and people are very angry, very disappointed from the international community, not putting high pressure on Israel to give us the vaccine or to give us the enough medical resources for our hospitals, because Israel is considered, according to Geneva Convention, is the occupying power, and they should be responsible about our health as Palestinians living under the Israeli occupation.
Thank you, Issa. Probably Muslim, want to add?
I think Issa has just summed it up rightly. We are under medical apartheid. I mean, nowhere in the world where a nation offered expired vaccines. This is preposterous. This is disgusting. They vaccinated their population, Israel, and they started to donate vaccines to other nations to bribe them to move their embassies to Jerusalem. Can you imagine? They did that with some Latin American countries, but very few, accepted this bribe. And when they needed new vaccines, they offered the Palestinian Authority expired vaccines. This government has no shame. But anyway, the situation is really difficult in both the West Bank and Gaza. The number of cases, I believe, is higher than that of Malaysia. Hundreds of thousands of infections. Many people don't go to medical centers and don't get the proper medical attention because of the lack of medical resources. I mean, in big cities, we hardly have one government hospital. In the case of Hebron, we have Alia Hospital, as far as I remember, catering for 1 million people in the southern districts in Hebron and its neighborhoods. That is not enough. So people don't have the numbers are not accurate. Even according to the health minister, the numbers should be doubled or tripled of infections. We again come back to the problem of occupation and apartheid. If we don't have Israel, I believe we would have done better. But we have this occupation which denies us export and import, denies us vaccines, denies people in Gaza treatment in neighboring countries. You have a lot of Israeli restrictions. So this regime dehumanizes Palestinians. They don't see us as equals. A friend today was asking me about child prisoners. He was wondering, why would Israel kidnap an 8-year-old child or a 14-year-old child? And the answer is simple. They don't see us as humans. They have been brainwashed with Zionism to the extent that they look down on everyone else. So a shock has to happen to this Israeli mentality, to the Israeli society, to the Israeli political establishment, to force them to abandon Zionism and abandon their apartheid mentality and regime. This way we can face problems like COVID.
Thank you, Muslim and Issa, for the response to the last question. And with the last question, we've reached the end of our program tonight. On behalf of the organizing committee of X3 Talks, I'd like to first thank the speakers for making their time, and of course to everyone watching. You can follow us on Twitter and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more X3 Talk series. And with that, as a closure, we'll play a video on the BDS movement for you to watch. Thank you so much. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Assalamualaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Israel could lose up to $11.5 billion a year if the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement peaks. That's if the EU legislates to boycott all Israeli goods and blocks foreign investment into the state. Is this likely to happen? Well, opinions vary. Israel's government economists say it's hard to predict, but it is possible. Foreign investment into Israel fell to around $6 billion in 2014. That's the same year they launched a deadly offensive on Gaza that killed 1,462 civilians. But by 2016, that figure had doubled to almost $12 billion. What about exports? Washington-based Brookings Institute says consumer boycotts won't drastically affect Israel's economy. But data from the World Bank shows Israel's intermediate exports dropped by nearly $8 billion in that same period. consumer boycotts work with academic and cultural boycotts. If people refuse to work with Israeli academic institutions for their involvement in, let's say, the strategies behind the use of disproportionate force against the Palestinians, or musicians refuse to perform in Israel in solidarity with the people of Gaza and the West Bank, it gets people talking. Lord, Elvis Costello, Lauryn Hill, they've all refused to play in Israel, and other artists are openly advocating for BDS.
How can I work with any institution complicit in Israeli human rights abuses?
These smaller boycotts are supposed to start a chain reaction.
Sanctions is the ultimate. That's why it's BDS. S comes at the end. It's no coincidence, because you need a lot of B and D to reach the S.
And it's slowly working. Companies are closing up shop in Israel. Some have been refused lucrative contracts explicitly for their involvement in Israeli occupation projects. Others are speculated to have been pressured by the BDS campaign into submission. But whatever their motives, they've divested from Israel. A UN report has also found 206 companies that are linked to illegal settlements. The companies' activities range from banking and telecom to construction and tourism. Their names are being withheld until they've all been contacted. US Ambassador to the UN Nikki Haley reportedly threatened the UN Human Rights Council with a cut in funding if the names were to be published. South American states have also disassociated themselves. Venezuela and Bolivia have cut ties with Israel, and Brazil refused to allow former leader of the settler movement, Danny Dayan, to be Israel's ambassador in the country.
The communities we established decades ago in the Jordan Valley will be here forever because they are essential for Israel's existence.
BDS, more than anything, is impacting brand Israel.
I'm less concerned today about any potential economic consequences. It's all about what you think of Israel, and whether you think Israelis are the good guys or the bad guys.
Image on the world stage would matter to any country. It's no different for Israel. Many prominent Israelis have claimed BDS is anti-Semitic and even a threat to the existence of Israel itself.
We're in the midst of an orchestrated global campaign to delegitimize Israel.
Mr. Asad Abu Khalil, who he knows very well, is a leader of the BDS movement. He writes, the real aim of BDS is to bring down the state of Israel.
The objectives of the BDS movement are: one, the liberation and the end of this occupation. Number two, the return of refugees to their homes and to their livelihoods. Number three is the end of apartheid and segregation and discrimination against Palestinians inside Israel and everywhere else.
Israel has refused all three time and again. The Netanyahu government instead enacted anti-BDS legislation at home and gave covert power to the Ministry of Strategic Affairs to tackle BDS abroad. They successfully lobbied a number of US states to punish supporters of the movement.
24 states have passed laws restricting their business with companies that boycott Israel just in the past 2.5 years. And these states are saying, we regard boycotting Israel to be a form of national, religious, or ethnic discrimination. It's bigotry, and we won't do business with it.
The ministry has since established a commando unit ordered to launch campaigns against pro-Palestinian projects. BDS has now been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. At the same time, Israel has banned the members of 20 activist groups from entering the country, including the Jewish Voice for Peace. Although Israel's economy has not been crippled by boycotts and divestments, the movement is having a serious impact on the country's reputation. And we all remember what that did to South Africa.
Is the distinguished representative of the Republic of South Africa.